Namaskar to all of you, and thank you Aditya and Arunima for the beautiful songs. And thank you Arunima for ending with Jema. So this is a series on Sri Aurobindo's book Synthesis of Yoga, and today's talk is on the topic, the chapter called The Master of Works. The Master of the Divine Works, the Master of Karma Yoga, or the Master of every action in this universe. The Divine Father, the Divine Mother is like a parent to the worker or the child within us, and it nurtures and grows this child in infinite different ways. Just like parenting, which is a combination of bit of disciplining and a bit of pampering the child, the same way the Divine Master or the Divine Parents grow us, evolve us, nurture us through a balance of a bit of pampering and discipline. Unlike human parenting, where sometimes there can be an over-disciplining or an over-pampering, the all-knowing Divine Consciousness always finds the balance between the two. Albeit the cycles of disciplining and the cycles of pampering can be of much longer time duration, be it a few years to few lifetimes in this case, but the all-knowing consciousness has its own balance. And an utmost gratitude to our Divine Parents, the Divine Father and Mother, for nurturing us, for growing us towards the perfection. And as the child of a God, as the child of the God, it is very important to carry that faith, a strong foundation of faith within ourselves, in order to grow at a steady pace on the path of yoga. Because at times this child within us can get bitter because of disciplining, or that child can be lost in that world of pampering. And this faith within us is constantly challenged by the so-called adult intellect, which judges things by its appearance. It judges things as failures or success, as sins and virtues, as mistakes and the right things, and in process cannot see the divine hand behind the things. This faith is also challenged by the Rajasic will within us, which wills to grow in a self-centered fashion. It wants to expand, it wants to grow all the time in its own self-centered fashion. And in process, it cannot see what is in the highest good of all and what is the Divine Parents willing for us, what is the best for all. And when the things don't align with the Rajasic will, then it gets bitter. Again, it cannot see that what is happening is actually happening in our best interest to grow us. And hence, the importance of the strong foundation of faith and patience on the path of yoga. this Rajasic will within us, even when it seeks the divine, it wants to take up the kingdom of the divine with a storm. It lacks that patience and faith for allowing the divine to work through us and gradually perfect our nature. And to this point, Sri Aurobindo quotes Srimad Bhagavad Gita that yoga must be continually applied with a heart free from despondent sinking. This is a very important point, because our heart in moments of failure or in moments of difficulties can turn towards self-doubt. It can turn towards grieving, which is a process of fragmentation of our being and getting lost in the unconsciousness. And for the yoga to happen, it is very important for the heart to be unified, and faith and hope and patience is that unifying force which turns it upwards. And that's why yoga must be continually applied with a heart free from this sinking into the unconsciousness. And always we must repeat to the doubting intellect the promise of the Master: I will surely deliver thee from all sin and evil, do not grieve. Here again, it happens to all of us who choose to walk on the path of yoga, which involves a lot of sacrifices. And somewhere in the middle of the road, this question arises in all of us that it's not like in one day one gains or acquires that divine perfection, and we make these mistakes and errors on the way, and sometimes we also commit the so-called sins on the way, and we are inflicted upon by the sin and evil. At that time the question arises, is it worth this much sacrifice? I have not gained the divine bliss, I have not experienced the divine presence, and at the same time I have left the regular human life and the pleasures of the life. So at that time this question arises, this doubt again arises in the mind of the sadhak, and that is where the doubting intellect needs to be continually reminded that I will surely deliver thee from all sin and evil. Do not grieve. Do not allow yourself to be fragmented. Be united in faith. And here again, the master, the divine master of our works, accepts our nature, accepts our grieving, accepts our fragmentation and the imperfections in our natures the way it is. The divine master suffers our mistakes and with patience reorganizes, purifies, and patiently transforms every aspect of ourselves. It is not like our own intellect, which has a tendency of rejecting and discarding one error or mistake and correcting it with another half-truth and half-falsehood. So the divine master of works has that patience to accept the imperfections in our nature and work through them. And one of the common examples is of something very often through our imperfect nature, how we sometimes commit these so-called sins in our life. And Sri Aurobindo describes the attitude towards what humanity or common human consciousness perceives as a sin. And he says that our sins are the misdirected steps of a seeking power that aims not at a sin, but at perfection, at something that we might call a divine virtue. Often they are a wheels of a quality that has to be transformed and delivered out of this ugly disguise. So our sins are in a way a certain hidden virtue which has lost its way and it needs to be transformed. So behind every sin there is a virtue which needs to be brought forward. An example that comes to mind is of Mahatma Gandhi as a child, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, how he, in his process of experimentations with truth, came face to face with falsehood, with lies, and how initially he perceived them as sins. But eventually, through his journey, through those sins, he discovered the principle of honesty, the virtue of honesty, and he became an ambassador of honesty in a way for humanity. In the same fashion, just like our sins, our failures, our mistakes also carry something hidden within themselves. Our failures are the Divine Master's intention behind failures is to direct us towards a greater truth, towards the road of a greater truth. How often it is true in our life that failures teach us much more than success. So it is failures rather than immediate success which leads us towards a greater truth. So that is the divine intention behind failures. The same applies to suffering also. Suffering is not so much of a punishment from the divine towards us, but suffering is also meant to lead us to the possibility of a greater delight. So the master of our works is neither a blunderer, nor an indifferent witness, nor a dallier with the luxury of unneeded evils. He is wiser than our reason and wiser than our virtue. So the divine is wiser than all the reasons that we can think of, and is also wiser than any virtue or a perceived virtue. And behind all failures, all sins, all mistakes, errors and suffering lies the divine hand. And it is something reassuring for all of us. But also it is not meant to be an excuse for making mistakes and errors and failures. It is meant to help us in those moments of failures and suffering to stay turned upwards rather than turning downwards into the unconsciousness, into self-doubt, but to stay open with faith and patience and allow the Divine Master to work through us and show us and bring forward those virtues, those possibilities of greater truths and delight. So the Divine Master, which is working through us, something in us has to shift, something in us has to be able to surrender and allow this Divine Master to work through us. There has to be a certain letting go of the doership in our action and allowing the Master of Works to work through us. And this again brings us to another difficulty or challenge in front of the sadhak. On one end, we talk about surrender, which is letting go of the doership and allowing the divine to work through us. And on the other end, the Master of Works accepts our individuality, accepts our imperfect nature, and the message for us is to not give up that individuality. To bring both together, which is letting go of doership and surrendering, and yet respecting the individuality and personality, is again another common challenge that a sadhak faces. And the common solutions that are offered is, one is to lose oneself into the impersonality. I am not the doer, the divine is working, I am no one, I am nothing. Or to forget about this divine possibility or the divine Master of Works working through us and be strongly attached to one's own individuality and just working through that. But Sri Aurobindo offers us a possibility of integration of both these things by sharing with us that spirituality is not about letting go of the individuality. It is about liberation of the true individual or the true person within us. And that true individual or true person within us is the psychic being or the soul in the depths of our being. And the process of liberation of this psychic being or the true divine person within us is not a process which happens in one day. It is a process of flowering or unfolding of a bud which flowers bit by bit. And until it flowers fully, it is not liberated also entirely. So our job in the present moment is to look at what is that next step that we can take towards this liberation. What is that next unfolding that is required in this true individual's progress in our life. And Sri Aurobindo in many of the previous chapters underlines the process of this unfolding of or the liberation of the true individual in us. The first step being self-consecration of our entire being to the divine, which Sri Aurobindo always remarks is a very relatively easy thing to start with, but something which is difficult to persist with an entire sincerity. An entire consecration of the whole of our being to the divine. The second step being the renunciation of any desire for the fruit or a particular preferred outcome, which again is not a shoving away of the fruit of the action, but seeking that divine presence and divine consciousness in every action, and that divine presence and consciousness itself includes all possible fruits, all possible outcomes within itself. So seeking the highest possible fruit in action rather than just seeking a small external fruit or outcome. And the third step in the process is of letting go of the doership, which is something which can only happen when there has been a certain degree of purification and liberation that comes from the first two steps of consecrating oneself entirely to the divine and renouncing the fruits of our actions. But at the same time, the first two steps cannot be complete without the third step being initiated. So all these three steps, consecration, renunciation, and surrendering the doership, are in a way not linear, but are happening simultaneously to all of us. It is only that in the initial phases, the sadhak focuses more on the consecration and the renunciation of fruit. And in the later stages, the sadhak's first focus is to allow the central egoism of doership to be shed, because doership is where the roots of our egoism lie, at the center of the being. So in the later stages, the sadhak initiates the process by letting go of the doership and allowing the divine Shakti to work through the sadhak, and then naturally there is a consecration and a loveful detachment from the fruits of the action. So it is these three steps, consecration, renunciation, and letting go of doership, which is the process towards the liberation of the true individual in us. Sri Aurobindo in this chapter shares further gradations on letting go of the doership of the action, because when we surrender the doership to the divine Shakti and try to uproot this egoism within us, then this ego takes refuge in another form, which is the ego takes over the desire to be a brilliant instrument of the divine. And this is another subtle form of the ego, where the person, the sadhak, feels, I want to be a brilliant instrument of the divine. And this happens when the sadhak, in the process of yoga, has come to realize the divine in fragments at a certain vital level, a certain mental realization, a certain intuitive perception starts to develop in the sadhak. And through that, an intense action starts to happen through the individual. And there are extraordinary results. That individual starts to become into a leader. That individual is the priest who becomes an instrument for great destructions or constructions, or clearing up the path for the whole humanity to progress forward. But yet, if at that point the sadhak allows that ambition or desire for greatness or pride to enter into him, then the ego of instrument becomes into a magnified ego, which then stands between the superficial self and the true divine figure. A typical example is from Ramayana of Ravan, who was a great yogi, who through his yogic sacrifices and his efforts and sadhana allowed himself to transform to a degree that a lot of siddhis came to him. But in process, there was a certain level of mastery or swaratha. And wherever the person starts to become swarat, there is a certain level of samrathood, a kingdom which starts to appear for the individual. And for Ravan, there was a large kingdom of Lanka, which was beautiful creation out of the siddhis and the mastery that he was bringing forward. But as he allowed ambition and pride to get in to the system, there was this magnified ego which started to enter within. And now he could not see the true divine. He could not see Sri Ram, which everybody else, even every ordinary individual could see, but he could not see it because there was a magnified ego which stood between his superficial self and his own true divine self. And so he could not see Sri Ram outside. So this is the danger on the path of yoga, or another pitfall that a sadhak goes through on the path of yoga. But here again, the master of works accepts our nature the way it is. So it accepts this magnified ego and works through it. The work of the divine will still go on even through this magnified ego. But the remedy for a sadhak, for this instrumental ego, is to house within himself not the lower cosmic forces of the Rajasic or the Sattvic will, but the true divine Shakti. So when the sadhak surrenders the doership, it is not to the lower cosmic forces or the lower prakriti forces of tamas, rajas and sattva, but rather to the divine Shakti, which is the universal will, which is working equally through all individuals, through all animate and inanimate objects. For that universal will, we are all the same. It is the same power working through each of these. And this is the remedy. The instrument needs to realize that it is like a pot created by a potter. So the beauty of the pot, or the merit of a beautiful pot, lies in the potter, not in the pot. So each one of us is a beautiful instrument of the divine, and the merit lies with the master of the works. And this point, Sri Aurobindo explains through this point that the attitude of our mind must not be, this is my strength, behold God's power in me. This is the attitude of the magnified ego, this is my strength, behold the God's power in me. So the attitude of our mind must not be this, but rather a divine power works in this mind and body, and it is the same that works in all men and in all animal, in the plant and in the metal, in conscious and living beings, and in things apparently incongruent and inanimate. So when this understanding and that awareness arrives within the self, that it's not my power, it's not my gifts, it is the power and the gifts of the divine, and it is that same power working in this mind and body and vital. It is that same power which is working in not just in other individuals, and here Sri Aurobindo very clearly emphasizes not just human beings, because somewhere in the collective consciousness of the humanity itself there is this magnified ego which puts its own existence above the existence of plants, animals and inanimate objects. So it is the same power is not just within every human being, but in every plant, every animal and every animate and apparently inanimate objects. And as through this process and through this repetition and action based on this paradigm, a sadhak continues to grow, and the master of works works through the imperfect nature, imperfect mind of a sadhak, then eventually the mind starts to become brilliant with that divine truth consciousness, and it turns into a spiritualized mind. And it develops the capacity of different possibilities of meeting the divine face to face. The whole reason of this magnified ego is because the realization was only at a vital level. The sadhak had not come face to face with the divine. There was an incomplete transformation of the spiritual substance, or an incomplete liberation of the true individual in us. But when this starts to happen more and more, the mind turns into a spiritualized mind and starts to come face to face with the divine in its three most common possibilities. The first possibility is of meeting the divine in its expanded, infinite, cosmic consciousness, or a universal form. And this universal form brings a certain degree of liberation, because it is about expansion and moving out of our individual mold into embracing the whole universe. But the challenge with the cosmic consciousness is that it does bring liberation, but it doesn't bring in that executionary power of the divine through which the work can happen at its best. The other possibility for the spiritualized mind to meet the divine is in its transcendent form, which is beyond the Maya, which is beyond the illusions of this Prakriti and beyond this universe in its transcendent form. There, the advantage is that one can see the world, the action of Prakriti and self beyond the illusions. But the pitfall is that there is a certain aloofness from this world. There is a loss of personality and again a loss of individuality. And for that, in the spiritualized mind, there is a third possibility, which is in the depths of our heart, where one can enjoy a personal relationship with the divine, a personality or an individual form of divine, be it Krishna, be it Shiva, be it Durga, whatever the form may be. The sadhak in the depths of his heart can enjoy a personal relationship with the divine. And from this space, there can be a bridging of the consciousness with the transcendent divine and the universal form of the divine. And that bridging allows a sadhak to, in a way, to a degree, integrate these three aspects of the divine, and it takes the sadhak closer towards the perfection and the surrender. But it is important to understand that the true nodus or the true point of integration of these three aspects of the divine does not lie at the level of the mind or even at the level of a spiritualized mind. Because mind always is a field of a combination of Sat and Asat. It is a creation of duality. So it cannot entirely hold the truth in its original form. And that's why the true integration of these three states happens at the level of the super mind, which is beyond the spiritualized mind. So we started with seeing ourselves as a divine child who aspires to grow, and in process of that growth, the child falls and falters, makes mistakes, goes through suffering. But for the child to grow steadily, a strong foundation of faith and patience and courage is essential. On the path of yoga, the child needs to embrace both letting go of the doership and at the same time the individuality. And the combination of that can happen in understanding that spirituality is not about impersonality. Spirituality is about liberating of the true individual within us. And the process of this liberation is a process of self-consecration, renunciation, and surrendering the doership. And when a sadhak does that, there has to be vigilance of very different forms of ego entering, the various different masks of Prakriti coming over. So there has to be a certain vigilance. And then the sadhak starts to come more and more face to face with the divine through the spiritualized mind, finding its bridge in the depths of the heart with an individual relationship with the divine. And eventually a possibility of meeting the divine in its absolute truth at the level of supramental consciousness. But here Sri Aurobindo talks about that it is not that the master of works is present only when we have the experience of the spiritualized mind or the supramental consciousness. The divine master of works is with us whether we are aware of it or not. In our day-to-day life, for every individual, it is the origin of every action and it is also the receiver of every action. As an individual grows, he then manifests to the individual through his ideals, whatever ideals of truth or beauty or compassion that an individual sets for himself. The divine master of works works through the sadhak through these ideals. As the sadhak grows further, or as the individual grows further, and he starts to choose causes or wills or purposes in life which are greater than just his own individual mold, in the mold of choosing to do things which are for the greater good of the humanity, the divine master of works manifests through those greater causes within the individual's lives. And when an individual's feet are set on the path of yoga, then the master of works starts to work through him through an individual relation or through the transcendent divine or as a universal form through the spiritualized mind. And eventually, Sri Aurobindo writes, at each step, their mere mental masks are shed and they acquire a larger, a profounder, a more intimate significance. So, at each stage, whether it is just behind the wheels of being an origin or receiver of the actions, or behind the ideals, or behind the greater causes, or as the divine personality, these masks or these wheels go on being shed, and there is a more and more intimate connection with the master of works. At last, on the supramental borders, all these godheads combine their forces and without at all ceasing to be coalesce together. So all these different faces of the divine at the supramental borders, they coalesce with each other and they become one. Om Tat Savitur Varam Rupam Jyotihi Parasya Dhimahi Yannaha Satyena Deepayet Yannaha Satyena Deepayet. Om Tat Savitur Varam Rupam Jyotihi Parasya Dhimahi Yannaha Satyena Deepayet Yannaha Satyena Deepayet. Om Tat Savitur Varam Rupam Jyotihi Parasya Dhimahi Yannaha Satyena Deepayet Yannaha Satyena Deepayet. Thank you.